In this lecture, we're going to be looking at an empire that has been somewhat overlooked in recent history, but essentially controlled the Middle East for centuries. Its daughter states number over 24, mostly in the Balkans, the Middle East, Turkey, and even up into North Africa with Egypt. So, although we don't know as much about it historically, its impact is being felt now. The Turkish identified Ottoman Empire controlled all the Middle East and a third of Europe for 400 years, which some historians say did a lot to connect the cultures in Western and Central Europe with those of the Middle East. After we go through this lesson, you'll understand East-West interactions in the recent past and help frame the political events that have created the modern Middle East. First of all, let's look at some basic facts of the Ottoman Empire. That's it at its maximum extents, which you can see on the map. It started its growth in regions in northwestern Anatolia, close to Constantinople, then expanded steadily, first through the Balkans and western Anatolia, then going up into Eastern and Central Europe, through North Africa, the Middle East, and out east all the way up to the borders of Persia. It monopolized trade routes to and from the Far East, particularly before the discovery of the New World. And also, as I mentioned in the last lecture, that when Jews and other non-Christian groups were experiencing persecution in Europe, many of these people would come to the Ottoman Empire for refuge. This was true also for Christian groups marginalized, such as the French Huguenots, after violence against them by different Catholic monarchs in France. The Ottoman Empire wasn't as concerned with denominational infighting and factionalism within Christianity, so because of this disinterest, Christian groups that were marginalized by their home country, or non-Christians, could typically come to the Ottoman Empire and experience greater tolerance in their homeland. And one other thing I want to mention is when I tell people I'm an Ottoman historian, the first image that comes to mind obviously is a overstuffed footstool, what we call an ottoman. Interestingly enough, the reason we call it that is because there was a certain style of furniture in Europe in the 19th century called Alaturka, where so-called exotic Orientalist Turkish-style furniture was very popular in Europe, and this would include overstuffed footstools. But the idea of Turkey and the Ottoman Empire and the East stayed very strong in the Western imagination in the 17 and 1800s. For example, if you're a classical music lover, there's a certain style of music called Turkish marches. Mozart and Beethoven produced these. These typically are very percussion heavy and mirror the type of military music in which Ottoman percussionists would lead the Ottoman military to their different battles. And there's a lot of other ways that the Ottoman Empire impressed upon Orientalist imaginaries in Europe in the 17th and 18th century, particularly when trade between the Ottoman Empire and Europe really increases at this time. It also surprises many people to learn that the predominant power in the Middle East for hundreds of years were Turks, not Arabs. At the time, the Turks would have likely been surprised. If you think about it, they don't have the same cultural pedigree as Arabic or Persian civilization does, who claim to have inherited the mantle of Near Eastern civilization. Turks originally come from Central Asia. They're not from where the domains of the Ottoman Empire are historically. They first encountered Islam as it expanded out from the Middle East, and Arab armies enslaved the shamanistic Turkic soldiers for their fearsome martial ability, and particularly for their ability to fight on horseback. They could very easily hit targets at full gallop. Through their encounters with Islam, many of them converted, and as the Byzantine defenses weakened on the eastern side of their empire, many of them flooded into Anatolia, and this is where the Ottoman Empire begins. In 1300, a Turkish chieftain named Osman formed a principality in northwestern Anatolia, which is today's Turkey. He conquered only a few towns in his lifetime, but his sons would go on to conquer fortresses, then cities, and then major armies. This snowball effect of these conquests continued for 7 generations until 1453, when his descendant Mehmet conquered Constantinople, which was the capital of the Byzantine Empire. At this time, the Byzantine Empire was very weak, and the empire really only included Constantinople and a few surrounding cities, what some historians today have described as a giant sickly head up top an emaciated body. Yet at the same time, it shocked the West when Constantinople was conquered, because it was considered the greatest city in Christendom for 1,000 years. The Hagia Sophia was the largest church in Christianity for 1,000 years, and only surpassed by St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. So this was a very shocking event that this upstart tribal confederacy that transformed into a proper state and an empire managed to conquer Constantinople. But the conquest continued over the years. Mehmet's grandson, Selim I, would expand his victories and conquer the Middle East in 1516 to 1517. And here he takes control of Egypt, Jerusalem, and the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. There's this invented tradition amongst the Ottomans that when the Ottomans conquered Mecca and Medina, the standards of the Prophet was delivered over to them, this sort of conferring the authority of the caliphate upon them. Now, most people think that the caliphate died after the Abbasid Empire was destroyed, but the Ottoman Empire worked very hard to fashion themselves as the protectors of all Muslims and the inheritors of the caliphate, and with that coming all of the religious respect and pedigree that came with it. A lot of historians argue that this is a way for them to embellish their history and give more religious authority than they really had. Again, they were basically an upstart. They were of Turkish background, semi-nomadic, and didn't have the same respectable history that Persians would in the East, or different Arabic groups who had closer familial and cultural ties to the early centuries of Islam and the Prophet Muhammad himself. They didn't have all this. So in a lot of their history, they're really inventing things to give themselves a better pedigree than they actually had. After the reign of Selim I, who conquered the Middle East, his son Suleiman the Magnificent, the 10th Ottoman Sultan, turned his sights toward Europe. He pushed far into the west and conquered Hungary, which the Ottomans would control for 150 years, and you can still find Ottoman architecture in Hungary, and even some mosques that were built at this time that have been converted back into churches after the Hungarians retook this area. Suleiman even reached the gates of Vienna in 1526 and boasted that he would soon capture it before moving to Rome. The siege failed, but the thought of a Turkish conquest of Europe haunted many European monarchs for the next 2 centuries. For example, the great reformer Martin Luther even worried that God was using the Turks to punish Europe for sins committed by the papacy. This anxiety continued until the Europeans began to push back and win military battles against the Ottoman Empire, starting in the late 1600s and continuing through the 17 and 1800s. One other remark on Martin Luther: he was very concerned that Germany would come under the control of the Ottoman Empire, which was completely plausible because Hungary had as well, and the conquests just keep coming. He actually wrote a treatise admonishing Christians on how to behave if they are to come under Ottoman rule, and if they are to be Christian subjects under Muslim authority, how do they continue on their lives as Christians? He tied this in a lot with how the nation of Israel in the Old Testament acted while under the captivity of the Assyrian Empire and the Babylonian Empire, in that they were good subjects, but they still did not worship any god except what Martin Luther thought to be the true God. So this is what he admonished Germans to do, that if you come under the authority of the Ottoman Empire, continue to behave as Christians, be good subjects, but don't renounce your beliefs. So it's interesting to think that although the conquest of Germany obviously never happened, this is a very real fear for a lot of prominent figures. Okay, but what happens with the contraction of the Ottoman Empire? The Ottoman Empire shrank throughout the 1700s and 1800s in the face of European military gains, the rise of Russia, and the spread of Western technologies, such as the steamship, the telegraph, and modern manufacturing. In response, the Ottomans saw their share of international trade plummet as merchants bypassed their Middle Eastern land routes in favor of using ships to reach the New World. In later centuries, the Ottoman Empire attempts to reform its laws by introducing equal rights for all subjects regardless of religion, but these attempts came too late. By the 19th century, it had become clear that the Ottoman Empire was not long for this world. As a result, the European press and politicians started to refer to it as the sick man of Europe. And a major political question at this time was called the Eastern Question of what do we do with the Ottoman Empire when it's technologically backward, its manufacturing is only a tiny sliver of what Europe is doing in the 1800s. And in the age of colonialism, there were many provinces that seemed ripe for the picking by colonial powers such as England, France, and others. And you have to remember at this time, this is the high water mark of European colonialism, which at the end of the 19th century controlled 80% of the globe. The Ottoman Empire was the only Muslim land that wasn't under European colonial domination. Almost everything in Africa was, much of Central Asia was. So many politicians thought it would be inevitable that the same would happen to the Ottoman Empire. These competing Ottoman and European visions would finally clash in the First World War, which is the event that created the modern Middle East, arguably. But just as a final note with this, there are interesting reform things. I don't want to paint this as the Ottoman Empire was sliding into just complete social breakdown and was hopelessly backward in every way. A lot of historians don't like to use the word decline to describe the Ottoman Empire because they think it gives it a teleology, that it's just doomed for destruction and can't reform. There are a lot of dynamic reform events that occur in the Ottoman Empire, particularly with edicts pronounced in 1839 and 1856, that reform the legal system rather than just being based on Sharia. They import a lot of French civil code as well. Court systems are also based on modern European law. There's tax reform. There are attempts to treat all Ottoman subjects equal under the law, regardless of religion. There are even attempts to give women far more rights. The success of these reforms are argued and they're questionable, and there's a lot of reforms that never took hold. For example, with manufacturing, steel production is just a tiny sliver of what exists in Europe and England or even Russia. There are very few railroad lines, and this is part of the reason why the Ottomans were hopelessly outmatched in World War I. They couldn't move supplies, they couldn't move troops. Troops had to march instead of use trains to travel around. It was still mostly an agricultural economy rather than an industrialized economy. So despite the many reform attempts, it's still economically, militarily, and politically just dwarfed by Europe at this time. So it falls apart in World War I, and its breakup is ultimately what creates the modern Middle East, its borders, and ultimately many of its tensions. So in the next lecture, we're going to look at World War I and the creation of the modern Middle East. Thanks for listening.